We received in a body all the generals and officers belonging to Hesse Castle. My mother was so tactful in consoling them for their defeat, in offering them her protection, that they almost forgot they were prisoners in the enemy's country. The Princess of Nassau and her daughter came every Sunday to see the Empress, and as our armies advanced, the princes from different occupied territories appeared to ask for my mother's protection. The Princess of Gotha, daughter of the Elector of Hesse Castle, was one of those with whom we sympathized most on account of her gentle manner and her father's misfortune. Among the official reports which reached us, several contained uncomplimentary remarks about the Queen of Prussia. We regretted this, and my mother wrote the emperor in regard to it. He answered that he detested scheming women more than anything else in the world, especially as she, the empress, had accustomed him to women who were gentle and kind. He told her how the tears of Madame Hatzfeld and her deep emotion had caused him to pardon her husband, and that consequently he did not deserve to be called unfair in his treatment of her sex. At Mayence, regiments known as Guards of Honor were quartered. These regiments were composed of young men belonging to the best and richest families in France who, rather than begin their military career as privates in one of the line regiments, preferred these special corps. The emperor had placed these regiments under the command of Monsieur de Montmorency Laval. Marshal Kellerman was in charge of their general organization and appointed the officers from among the recruits themselves. Monsieur de Talleyrand asked me one day to recommend Monsieur de la Baudoyer, a cousin of Monsieur de Flau. What a good reason for me to interest myself in him. I obtained his nomination as second lieutenant, and he came to thank me. The officers were in the habit of calling on the Empress in the evening. I spoke more with Monsieur de la Baudoyer than with the others. The desire to make a good impression on the person one cares about is so natural that unconsciously we are inclined to seek out those who are related to him by ties of birth or affection and who will talk to us about him. We are more anxious to please these relatives, perhaps because we feel at ease with them, and in speaking to one we think of the other. Monsieur de la Baudoyer was a highly strung man full of romantic ideas which he concealed under an icy manner. He had enlisted against the wishes of his parents and against his own political conviction. Although hostile to the emperor, he did not consider that this prevented him from entering a career which he considered honorable. His face and figure were strikingly handsome, but his character was unsociable. Detesting society, he had adopted a surly attitude and an abrupt manner of speaking. Women feared rather than admired him. They felt him to be an ironic and severe critic of their behavior. In spite of this, he was an admirer of Adam de Stael, with whom he had acted tragedies at Coppet, for he had as fine a diction as Talma himself. Monsieur de la Baudoyer had discovered, thanks to his sense of values, that drawing-room successes do not mean as much as honors gained on the field of glory. He had deserted society in order to play a part in another, sterner and more glorious setting. The talks I had with him were all about idealism and the principles of magnanimity. I never imagined our talks were of a kind calculated to give him a far too flattering opinion of me, an opinion which later interfered with his happiness. We went to Frankfurt for a few days' visit to the Prince Primate, who gave very fine receptions in our honor. Evening parties, concerts, balls, excursions filled the short time we spent there. I attended a masked ball, where the novelty of the scene amused me greatly, but where I felt much embarrassed and did not venture to speak to anyone or leave the arm of my Dutch lady-in-waiting. All the people had imagined they recognized me and crowded about a lady seated in a chair specially prepared for me. It was one of the emperor's pages who took my part. This mistake in itself was enough to amuse me. On our return to Mayence, Monsieur de la Baudoyer assured me that he had recognized a woman with a mask with whom he had had a long conversation. If I wished, he could repeat this talk word for word as he had written it all down. He asked to be allowed to present me the count the next day. Curious to know if someone had passed herself off for me, I took the paper, and as the incident had taken place at a reception on my return home, I began to read his note aloud to the ladies who were in attendance. It was a love letter, delicately and tactfully worded, but so indiscreet and so flattering that I did not dare believe it intended for me. In this note, Monsieur de la Baudoyer declared that for a long time he had dreamed of an ideal being. Life had taught him how rare it is to encounter a woman worthy of one's love. He had followed the ordinary rounds of pleasures, filled with contempt for them and longing to find his ideal. Suddenly, when he had given up all hope, he discovered this ideal before him exactly as he had imagined her, equally fair, equally kind, equally virtuous. He recognized the extent of his misfortune. He knew how remote from him his vision remained and all that stood between them. Her very moral perfection was a greater obstacle even than her rank, but at least he had beheld the object of his dreams. No longer would his fancy roam idly this way and that. Now all his ardor was turned toward a definite goal. She, who had not been able to conceal her identity beneath a mask, would from now on become his lodestar, the guide of his destiny, the influence that would make him do good and keep him from evil. He desired to have the opportunity to say all that he dared hardly write. Surely she would not take offense, as the speaker would be a man about to take his departure, perhaps forever. He ended his letter by begging the person who had asked to write it to forgive his having done so. I was extremely embarrassed. I refused to admit that these phrases were meant for me. My name was not mentioned, but all my ladies assured me I was the person referred to. I was the more surprised as Monsieur de la Baudoyer had never said a word that would have made me think he was interested in me. I was also much annoyed at having revealed to strangers sentiments the writer had certainly not intended them to know. To be sure, I was not really to blame, for I had had no idea of the contents of the letter, but as a matter of principle, I believe one cannot be too discreet as regards matters of sentiment, and I was vexed at having disclosed anyone's secret. I saw Monsieur de la Baudoyer again and made no reference to the matter. He seemed unhappy and ill at ease. I no longer had any doubt as to the identity of his ideal and reproached myself for having been unduly agreeable to him. He had not guessed the motive for my actions. He had misinterpreted them. I had been wrong, and it was necessary for me to remedy my fault and calm the overenthusiasm of which he might be the victim. I am always prompt in the execution of a plan that seeks to achieve some good purpose. The more difficult it is for me to carry out, the more I persuade myself it must be done, and that I must overcome my natural reluctance, which alone prevents. Consequently, on the same evening that I had made up my mind how to act, I approached Monsieur de la Baudoyer, and in the course of our conversation, I uttered the following speech in a firm, although somewhat embarrassed voice. I should deeply regret it if anyone became attached to me. I could not return his affection. I only care for the respect of those who know me. My fate and my feelings have been fixed once and for all, and only misfortune could befall a person who cares for me in the least. There is a certain inner satisfaction that can only be felt by a highly refined conscience. I was pleased with myself. I believed I had cured a man who was suffering, even though I had been obliged to lessen his good opinion of me. I had, to be sure, sacrificed my vanity to some extent, but I had performed a good deed. And when you feel you have done that, you experience a sense of satisfaction greater than any flattery to your self-esteem. Meanwhile, Monsieur de la Baudoyer left to join the army. When he said goodbye to me, he was obviously moved. His generally severe manner made his emotion all the more apparent. About this time, there arrived at Mayence a young man at the point of death. How sad I felt when I discovered that this, too, was my fault. I heard about it through Mademoiselle Cochelet. When in Paris, she often met at the house of one of her mother's friends, a Monsieur de Charette de la Colinière, nephew of the famous Charette de la Vendée. He had heard Mademoiselle Cochelet's complimentary remarks about me and listened with interest, making her describe the sorrows of my home life, of which she was so frequent a witness. She herself had been strongly attracted by this young man, so gifted in mind and so handsome in person that few women dared to go about with him for fear of being stared at. Since the subject interested him, she talked frequently of me in order to secure his attention. He never saw me except in the ballroom and never spoke to me, but finally his imagination was fired by hearing me praised so often, and he declared that he loved me. Mademoiselle Cochelet, instead of being jealous, considered his feelings quite natural. She had been aware of his sentiments before he knew them himself, felt responsible for having aroused them, and was happy to have them confided to her. The more he talked about me, the more she cared for him. He enlisted in the regiment of La Tour d'Auvergne in the hope of being nearer to me. Left it when I went to Holland, and under a cover of a pleasure trip through that country, came there for the purpose of catching a glimpse of me. He arrived the very day I was leaving for Wiesbaden. The fatigue of the journey and grief at my departure affected his health, which was already delicate. He broke a blood vessel in his chest, returning to Paris spitting blood, but instead of taking care of himself, came back to Mayence to take part in the campaign. When he arrived there, he was too feeble to go any further. Mademoiselle Cochelet was overcome with grief to have been the cause of such a tragedy and told me everything. Although I reproached her for having talked so much about me, the harm had been done. I asked her, nevertheless, to say as many disagreeable things regarding me as she had previously said flattering ones. Mademoiselle Cochelet begged me out of kindness to receive Monsieur de la Charette once in order to persuade him to return to his family. I did so. I pretended to know nothing about his sentiments toward me and talked entirely about how much Mademoiselle Cochelet cared for him. He showed that he appreciated what she did for him, and before he left, he ceased to speak of me and asked her to become his wife. His death put an end to this plan. I only heard of it several months later at a time when the intensity of my own grief prevented me from being greatly affected by the news. It was during this journey that I became better acquainted with Monsieur de Talleyrand. I had often wondered how people could praise his wit and consider him so clever when he so rarely displayed those qualities. For years, I had watched him enter the drawing room of Malmaison with his careless and distant air. He dragged along his clubfoot, leaned against the first chair he encountered, and barely bowed to the people present. He hardly ever spoke to me. At Mayence, on the other hand, he sought my company and took the trouble to make himself agreeable. I was surprised and even flattered. The attentions of a man who is generally aloof make a special impression. I am convinced that Monsieur de Talleyrand's reputation for cleverness, which I admit he deserves, is less the result of anything remarkable that he does than of the little he says, but says so well. He is chiefly remarkable for his epigrams, his perfect tact, his great skill in discovering the reasons for other people's actions and concealing his own motives, the self-confidence of a great lord, and a natural, tolerant indolence, which make him so easy and agreeable to get on with, that people consider it a sign of kindness of heart. He is indulgent towards all forms of vice and is willing to listen patiently to plans of schemers, especially if their projects have any chance of success. His only comment on what he is told is an approving smile, and he takes care to alarm no one and to exploit success by whomever it has been achieved. The attractive quality of his mind makes up for his lack of moral strength, and he finds himself at the head of a movement which people think he organized, when in reality he was hardly even the confidant of those who really started it. His very reputation for possessing great charm, although founded on fact, is largely due to the vanity of those with whom he comes in contact. I myself succumb to it. The day he condescends to speak to you, you are conquered by the fact that he does so, and you are quite prepared to adore him if he merely asks after your health. Monsieur de Remusat, who trimmed his sails to every breeze, followed Monsieur de Talleyrand about, and, imitating his model, no longer said a word, in the hope that by adopting this pose he might make himself important. At Mayence, he was said to keep the police informed of what went on in society. He sent reports to Marshal Duroc, and the young ladies did not dare to be seen chatting with young men for fear of providing material for the reports of Monsieur de Remusat. I had hoped for an instant to go to Berlin with my mother for the signing of the peace, but the war kept on. My husband left the army of which he was in command and wrote me to return to The Hague. As long as he was in danger, I forgot all the harm he had done me. But when I no longer had any reason to feel alarmed on his account, I began to fear for myself. being accustomed to obey, I left Mayence shortly after New Year's Day, 1807. I remember the date because if I had been inclined to believe in premonitions, I should have had good reason to be alarmed just then. Every time anyone wished me Happy New Year, tears came to my eyes. My present distress was enough to dampen my spirits, and besides that, I was about to leave my mother without knowing when I should see her again. I was returning to a foreign land where no one knew me, where there was no one to protect me. And from whom did I need to be protected? From my husband. In addition to all this, I foresaw, I do not know why, still more trouble in the near future. I was frightened at my state of mind. What is going to happen to me this year? I asked Adele when I found myself alone with her. What can be worse than what you endure, she replied. Have you not enough reason to be unhappy without inventing imaginary ones? Her common sense impressed me, but sometimes a painful mood continues without any good ground for it. I left Mayence deeply depressed. The season was bitterly cold. Nevertheless, my always delicate health had somewhat improved. I arrived at The Hague a few days after the sad accident at Leyden. My husband, on this occasion, had behaved in a manner that had won the admiration of the Dutch. As soon as the news of the explosion reached him, he hastened to the spot, encouraged the rescue parties, and in order to save those who were injured, did not hesitate to expose himself to the danger of being crushed by the tottering walls. My heart ached as I passed through the city. I wished to do my share in helping the unfortunate victims, and I gave 20,000 francs for those who were the most in need. My husband objected, but I insisted on doing this. As a rule, he did much for the poor. Even in Paris, he gave large sums, and in Holland, his gifts were enormous. If I happened to give someone a fixed income in response to a request for help, I was sure that if he heard of it, he would double the amount without being asked. It seemed as though he were trying to efface the impression made by what I had done. I may have been mistaken in thinking this, but at any rate, I believed it at the time. Consequently, instead of visiting charitable organizations, helping them extend their work, and in general concerning myself with philanthropy, as a queen should do, I only went out driving and displayed the most complete indifference to everything that went on in order to give no grounds for my husband's displeasure. When I arrived at The Hague, the king had already been there for some time. In the evening, my ladies in waiting and the officers of his household were in the habit of meeting in his apartments. There was no formality about these receptions, and it was more like a family gathering than a royal court. People played parlor games, and sometimes the fun became even boisterous. As soon as I was back, no one was allowed to enter my drawing room any longer. Everything became serious and impressive, and even the simplest gatherings were forbidden. One morning, without any reason being given, all the French who had rooms at the palace received orders to leave at once and secure quarters in town. Not a moment's delay was allowed, and everyone wondered, what can have happened last night? What can be the cause of this abrupt and drastic order? A little later, a still more extraordinary order was issued. From 6 o'clock on, no one was allowed to enter or leave the palace without a card signed by Monsieur Senegras. Tradespeople were arrested. Others thought they would be obliged to spend the night in the halls. Every day there would be misunderstandings and ridiculous situations which people laughed about among themselves and which I heard of only through my young ladies. I could not see the humor in these incidents as they did, for to me they had too serious a meaning. The Dutch thought at first that all these precautions, which they could not understand, were due to suspicions regarding them, and they were indignant. Later, when they discovered that it was all owing to domestic misunderstandings, a thing which surprised them greatly, for we had arrived with the reputation of being a model couple, they paid no more attention to the new regulations. As I always considered my husband's obvious jealousy a public insult, I had been much embarrassed by the first appointments he had made in Holland of the members of my household. My equerry was Baron de Renesse, a very worthy woman who, had he lived in the days of Cervantes, might have served as a model for Don Quixote. The chamberlain, Monsieur van der Dun, was still more ridiculous in appearance, although with a fine mind. The Frenchman, who always loved a joke, insisted that he looked like a Sancho Panza who had swallowed a jumping jack. The other members of my household were of the same kind. Of all the handsome Brussels guard of honor who formed part of our escort, and of all the young men belonging to the best families of France, who had asked for posts at our court, the king chose only Monsieur de Marmont, a fine man in everything except looks. These appointments were so arbitrary and so evidently inspired by my husband's jealousy that they always annoyed me. As my equerries were all of them at least 60 years old, I never dared ride fast when I went out on horseback on their account. A Frenchman who was only 50 was not allowed to remain long attached to my household. He was ordered back to his regiment and obliged to leave within 24 hours. It was in vain that Monsieur de Caulaincourt, our High Chamberlain, intervened, asking that the man be permitted at least to finish his week's service in order not to seem to have been dismissed through some fault of his own. Monsieur de Caulaincourt's intervention was useless. It appeared that in spite of his years, the man might have attracted me.